BirdLife South Africa chooses an annual Bird of the Year to feature. This species is promoted and used to tell a conservation story through our posters, educational materials, magazine articles, and other media. This year, it is the Cape Gannet, and our Pamela Isdale Fellow of Penguin Conservation, Christina Hagen, is here to tell us more about this special and endangered seabird.
Hello everyone, I'm very pleased to talk to you today about the Cape Gannet, BirdLife South Africa's Bird of the Year for 2022. I did my master's thesis on the Cape Gannet a number of years ago, and although I now work on the African penguin, the Cape Gannet is still one of my favorite seabirds. BirdLife South Africa chooses a Bird of the Year every year as a way of raising awareness about the species that we've chosen, but also how it links to the broader environment and to push environmental education. So these are the last three birds of the year: the secretary bird, the southern ground hornbill, and the Cape rock jumper. So the Cape Gannet was chosen as we felt that a seabird would be appropriate in the year that we did our epic flock to Marion voyage, as well as the fact that the Cape Gannet is a good ambassador for several marine issues that face a lot of our coastal seabirds. Unfortunately, it faces quite a lot of threats, so we're able to provide education on those threats. So the Cape Gannet is part of the Sulidae family, and there are 11 species in 3 genera. There is the genus Sula, which encompasses the boobies, like this blue-footed booby on the screen. And then Papa Sula is the kind of archetypal sulid, but funnily enough, there's only one species in that genus, the Abbott's booby. And then the genus Morus, which contains the gannets, of which there are 3 species. The Cape Gannet, the Northern Gannet, and the Australasian Gannet. Now, I just wanted to say a few words about the naming of these species. Unfortunately, when they were named, people weren't very kind to them. So the word booby derives from the Spanish word bobo, which means stupid. Morus is also not much better. It means foolish. Gannet is a variation of a Dutch word for goose, so that's where gannet comes from. And then of course the Afrikaans malchus is also not very kind to these birds, which means mad goose or foolish goose. Sometimes if you watch them at their colonies, it's not necessarily a bad description. They can be quite clumsy, and I think the foolish kind of naming came about because the gannets and boobies, in fact, as well, were very naive to humans and wouldn't run away when the kind of European explorers would approach them, and that's how they got their names. So now on to some identification for the Cape Gannet. They are beautiful birds, fairly large seabirds, adults weigh in around 2.8 kilograms, and their wingspan is about 170 to 185 centimeters. They're quite easy to distinguish at sea. They're large white birds with black primaries, and they have this beautiful yellow head and the pale blue eye-ring around a pale iris. And they also have a long black gular stripe. They can be easily confused with the other species of gannets, but fortunately for us, their distributions usually don't overlap. There have been a couple of cases of Australasian gannets turning up at some of our Cape Gannet colonies, and they have a shorter gular stripe, and the iris is dark grey as opposed to pale sort of yellow grey of the Cape Gannets. The juveniles and the fledglings look a bit different. The fledglings are, I think, quite beautiful with their sort of black and white speckled plumage. The juveniles are a bit more mottled looking as they molt over sort of 3 or 4 years into the pure white adult plumage. The morphology of the birds is of the sexes is quite similar. It's very difficult to tell males and females apart from the naked eye. There are slight differences in size when you measure them, but that's very difficult to tell when you are just looking at gannets. But there has been some work recently looking at the vocalizations of the males versus the females. So I'm just going to play the male call now. And then this is the female. There are very subtle differences in the calls, the speed at which the different with which the male and the females call. So if you listen very carefully and they're calling at a colony, you can tell them apart. The distribution of the Cape Gannet, they are endemic to the Benguela upwelling system, which is the current that runs along the west coast of Southern Africa up to Namibia. And historically, they bred at 10 islands off the coast of South Africa. You can see that with the open stars are the extinct colonies, and then the red stars are the 6 colonies that exist today. And there are 3 in South Africa and 3 in Namibia. When they're breeding, they tend to stay fairly close to the islands, although they can go up to over 100 kilometers from the islands. When they're not breeding, or the juveniles, they can disperse quite far and often go up, especially the west coast of Africa, and can go sort of 1,000 to 2,000 kilometers away from their colonies. Now, unfortunately, their population isn't in such a good state at the moment. In the 50s and 60s, the bulk of the Cape Gannet population was in Namibia, as you can see from the little graphic on the left-hand side there. But unfortunately, as the fish stocks in Namibia collapsed, the population there decreased very rapidly, and now the bulk of the population is in fact in South Africa and at one colony at Bird Island in Algoa Bay. In 2017, the Cape Gannet population the Cape Gannets were listed as endangered on the red list due to a more than 50% decrease in their global population over the previous 20 years. So you can see also from the animation that the kind of bulk of the population has shifted around the coast, down from Namibia around South Africa into the Eastern Cape. And that is partly due to the movement of fish stocks, and I'll get onto that a bit later. I just wanted to say a little bit about their life history and their breeding. So Cape Gannets generally only breed on flat coastal islands. They can breed in very dense colonies with nests about 40 to 60 centimeters apart, which is kind of out of pecking distance of their neighbors. And it's quite incredible to see a gannet colony during the breeding season. It's just this cacophony of noise and bird movement, but somehow they manage to make sense of it all. And if you watch for long enough, you can as well. So both sexes help build the nest, which is a small mound with a cup-shaped depression in it. And it's usually built out of guano, but it can also contain vegetation or whatever's around the nest. The female will lay 1 egg, it's 99% of the time is one egg, some very, very occasionally two. Laying happens from mid-September to mid-December, and incubation is shared by both parents, and they take turns going to sea to forage and incubating the egg. Now, a lot of birds have brood patches, which is a bare patch of feathers on the breast. Gannets can't have this because it would make them too cold when they go into the icy sea. So they actually incubate the egg on their feet. So they pump nice warm blood into their feet, and they actually sort of stand gently on the egg. Incubation takes about 40 days, and as I said, the parents take shifts. And when the egg hatches, the chicks don't have any down. They're so ugly they're cute almost, and yeah, they're very, very helpless. They weigh about 70 grams at hatching, but they grow very rapidly, as you can see in this progression of photos, reaching their maximum weight after about 80 days from hatching. The parents will take it in turns to go and get food for the chicks while the chick is very young. Usually they spend about 24 hours at sea fishing and gathering enough food and bringing it back to feed the chicks. Until the chick is about 40 days old, sort of the middle picture size where it can be left on its own, where it's less vulnerable to predators, and the energy demand of the chick is getting greater, so that both parents need to go to sea to hunt for food. And they are covered in this down that gradually gets replaced with their juvenile feathers. So the chicks are fed by regurgitation, and they eat up to about 120 grams per day when they're quite young, but that can increase to over 400 grams a day, which is quite a lot of food for the parents to have to bring back. And when the chick fledges, they're often heavier than the adults, which helps them to survive the first few days or weeks when they're learning to hunt for themselves, because there's no parental care after fledging. So all this food helps them progress through this awkward phase, awkward teenage phase, where they sort of have some down and some flight feathers, and then they eventually get their full waterproof flight feathers. And at this stage, they will leave the nest, or their parents will stop coming to feed them, and eventually they'll get hungry enough to leave the colony and try and work out how to hunt and how to be a gannet. They have a very impressive foraging technique. So their main prey that they go after are small pelagic shoaling fish, which particularly sardine and anchovy. And they are beautifully efficient predators of these small fish. I'm sure many of you have seen footage of gannets diving or seen photos. Once they locate a school of fish, they can often be quite high above it, and then they plummet into the water using the momentum of their fall to carry them up to about 30 meters. And they fold their wings back to aid them in getting the speed, and they can enter the water at speeds of up to 100 kilometers an hour. They are able to do this because they have special air sacs in their breasts which cushions the blow, and also they don't have external nostrils, so the water doesn't get forced up as they hit it with such high speeds. But it is truly an amazing sight to see. They often forage in these big flocks of other gannets, and there is evidence that They work with other species, or not work with, but are benefited by other species, subsurface predators such as dolphins, tunas, and even penguins, which kind of force the schools of fish up towards the surface where they are more easily accessible to gannets and other flying seabirds. So the gannets often will cue in on other activity happening below the surface, which cues them into the fact that there is a fish school there. There has been a lot of research into how gannets find their prey, and there's evidence that they exchange information at the colony, and they do this by dancing. So you can see, if you look in the red circle, the one gannet is coming back from sea and being greeted by its partner. And these are kind of ceremonial dances, courtship dances, that kind of reaffirm the bond between the pair. But they also found that the duration of the dance was correlated to the feeding conditions at sea. So the dances were shorter when the conditions were worse. So there is some evidence that the gannets learn some information when they change over between the partners. Another recent study was looking at, so the study put cameras onto gannets and then observed the behavior as the birds were heading out to sea. And so they found that gannets sometimes would change direction suddenly while they were at sea, and by using the cameras, they found that when gannets that were leaving the colony saw other gannets returning to the colony, they would change direction and then follow the direction that the returning gannets were coming from. And they found that gannets that did respond to seeing other gannets found food twice as fast as gannets that did not change their behavior or their direction of flight. So I mentioned earlier that their foraging range can be quite constrained when they're breeding, not as much as penguins, which can only go about 40 kilometers. Cape Gannets can go a lot further, up to actually 500 kilometers of their breeding colony. And outside the breeding season, they can travel much, much further away, going up the west coast of Africa and even the east coast, just following where the fish are. And there are three things that can affect the foraging range. Now this is looking at the breeding season. So obviously the distribution of the prey. So on these maps, the colored blobs are where the fish are, and then these circles or contour lines are where the gannets spent their time. So their foraging range overlaps a lot with where the fish are, and the further the fish are from the colonies will dictate how far the gannets have to go. There are also differences between males and females, and it seems like females actually forage further away from the colonies. So the red are the female tracks, and the blue are the males. And these are just two different years. And then also there are differences in breeding stage. So as the chicks grow, so this is the top one on the right here is when they're actively having to guard the young chicks. And then the bottom one is when the chicks are a bit older, so they can leave them alone for longer, so they can go much further away to find food. Now onto some of the threats that the Cape Gannets face. I mentioned that they face quite a number of them. The biggest one is the threat of food scarcity. Their population sizes are linked to the abundance of sardine and anchovy. And the collapse of the sardine stocks in Namibia in the 70s was what caused the dramatic decrease of gannets there. In South Africa, luckily, our stocks didn't collapse. But from the mid-90s, there has been this shift in the distribution of fish. So the gray blobs are where the fish were distributed in the 90s, just a kind of representative view of this. And then the colored ones is the distribution from the mid-90s onwards. And you can see it's more along the southern Cape Coast all the way along to PE. And that's what drove the shift, well, the fact that now the largest Cape Gannet colony is in Algoa Bay. And also affecting the gannets is the fact that the current biomass of fish is very low and has been for the last few years. And this also is exacerbated by competition with the sardine fishery. Now, related to the scarcity of prey is the fact that gannets can switch their prey if they need to. If they're not finding sardine and anchovy, they can switch to feeding on sori, which is another small fish in the mackerel family, or they can feed on fishery discards. So in this map, you can see the anchovy distribution is in green, and the gannet distribution is in red, and the purseine fishing, which is the fishery that goes after the sardine and anchovy, is in blue. And you can see that Cape Gannet isn't really overlapping with either of these, so it suggests that they aren't eating sardine and anchovy. And this is because, so this is just a zoomed in map, this blue shows the hake catches. So you can see they're foraging around the hake trawl vessels. And so they're eating the fishery discards, the heads and guts that get discarded when they process the catch. Now, unfortunately, sori and fishery discards aren't as energy rich as sardine and anchovy. The gannets, it's a problem because the chicks need this very energy-rich, calorific food that is provided by the sardine and anchovy. And hake only provides less than 3/4 of energy of the sardine. And that means that the chicks grow much more slowly and have a much lower survival rate when they're fed on fishery discards compared to when they're fed on the natural diet of sardine and anchovy. And now the other problem with this junk food, we call it junk food, is that the gannets are at risk of being caught in the fishing nets as accidental bycatch. And this can occur in two ways. Either the gannets get entangled in the net as it is hauled aboard with the fish in it, or they collide with the warp cable which tows the net behind the boat. And that's quite a big problem. In 2008, which was the last time someone really estimated this, it was thought that over 2,000 gannets were killed in the trawl fishery every year, which is really not sustainable. And I'll get onto some of the mitigation measures against this shortly. So you can see that the three threats are related. The food scarcity causes them to feed on the junk food, which then affects the chicks and also puts the adults at risk of being caught as bycatch. Other threats include seal predation and displacement. This can be a big problem, especially around Malgas Island, on the west coast, where seals prey on the fledglings. As they're leaving the colony, they tend to sit on the water because it's easier for them to take off from the water than from the land, and this makes them easy prey for the seals, unfortunately. And also, seals coming ashore on their islands can also displace the gannets. Then there's also the impact of climate change with heat waves and increasing frequency and intensity of storms, which can flood the low-lying islands where they breed. There's also predation on the eggs and chicks by kelp gulls and great white pelicans. And then, of course, there is the ever-present threat of oil spills with increasing shipping, and then also disease such as avian cholera and avian influenza. In 2018, avian flu killed about 1,600 birds. So it is a potentially growing problem. So that was all the doom and gloom of the threats. There are a lot of conservation actions being done to try and help save the gannets and other seabirds. So the first one is bycatch mitigation. So there's been a lot of work done by my colleagues in the albatross task force to try and prevent the gannets and albatrosses and petrels and other seabirds being caught in accidentally in fisheries. And it's mostly to do with this device here, the bird scaring line, which keeps the birds away from the dangerous areas where they can get entangled. And it's been very successful for albatrosses, decreasing seabird bycatch by about 99%. It's a bit less effective for the gannets, as they can dive into the water and avoid the bird scaring lines, but it has still been a very effective conservation measure. The next one is marine spatial planning, and this is helping to mitigate against the threat of the lack of food. And that is to try and identify areas that are important for gannets to use and to put protection in place, such as the marine protected area, which has restricted use zones that was put in place around Bird Island recently. And this can help minimize the risk of oil spills near colonies, because ships can't go into that area, and it helps reduce the competition between the seabirds and fisheries. And these important areas are designated because we know where the birds go and what areas are important to them. And a lot of the work has been done on the breeding colonies. So we know very well where the Cape Gannets go during breeding, and that's through putting these, as you can see here, these GPS tracking devices on the gannets, which log their movements. However, the non-breeding distribution is unknown for Cape Gannets, and that is a quite big part of their life history, and also is a period where they're quite vulnerable, and we don't know where they're going and what threats they may be facing. So my colleague Hagen Carpenter-Kling is starting a project to track the Cape Gannets outside the breeding season, and it's quite exciting. Hopefully we'll be able to start that next year. Then there are other conservation strategies to reduce some of the other threats, which include implementing protocols to reduce the human spread of disease-causing pathogens. Then there are also programs underway to remove the problematic seals that are either causing the displacement or the predation. And quite an interesting story is that in 2006, I think it was, the Cape Gannets were displaced almost completely from Bird Island in Lambert's Bay, and the birds were attracted back. They could see them circling the island. Once the seals had been chased off, the gannets were reluctant to land, so they they carved a lot of these gannet decoys to try and get the gannet to convince them that it was safe to return to the colony. And then there's also the very successful program called Pelican Watch, which stations volunteers on the islands in Saldanha Bay, which are affected by great white pelican predation. And these volunteers help keep the pelicans away from the Cape Gannets and also the cormorants, which are very heavily affected by predation. So just before I end off, I'd like to let you know about all the Bird of the Year initiatives. So if you go onto the BirdLife South Africa website and look for the Bird of the Year page, you can download various posters, infographics, and lesson plans, and they're all beautifully illustrated by Lee Wolfhart, who's done all of these beautiful illustrations. We also have a whole bunch of Bird of the Year merchandise, stuffed toys, t-shirts, and these lapel pins like I'm wearing here. And then also we have this beautiful painting which was painted by an artist called Willie Sonnenberg and donated by him and his son Dan, which we are selling. It has been framed. We're selling it to raise funds for our Cape Gannet research, as I mentioned, that Hagen is trying to start on the non-breeding birds. And so it is actually on auction at the bird fair. So please go and check it out and perhaps put in a bid. And finally, I would like to say thank you very much to our main sponsor of this initiative, which is the Hans Holhausen Charitable Trust. And thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Christina. Your and the Seabird Conservation Program's work to conserve gannets and our other endangered seabirds is so appreciated. The Cape Gannet is a fantastic ambassador for our coastal seabirds and is a true ocean sentinel. We are all looking forward to the announcement of 2023's Bird of the Year during the annual Birding Big Day weekend. After the short break, we will have our AV Tourism Project Manager, Andrew de Block, introducing our exciting Go Birding platform with over 400 birding sites featured. On Feeder 1, we will have some live interviews with special guests, followed by a special feature on some of Africa's most exciting and loved species. Do take the opportunity to make your bids on our silent auction and to explore the site.